Now I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speaker, who is Neil Malhotra, the Edith Cornell Professor of Political Economy at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. In addition to being a professor in the Graduate School of Business, he also has an appointment in the Department of Political Science, and he serves as the director of the Center for Social Innovation at the Stanford Business School. He's authored over 60 articles on numerous topics, including American politics, political behavior, and survey methodology. His research has been published in the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, among other publications. He's an associate editor of Public Opinion Quarterly and the Journal of Experimental Political Science. He received his MA and PhD in political science from Stanford University and is an undergraduate from Yale. So with that, I'll turn it over to Neil for our presentation today. Neil?
Thanks so much, Gordon, for that introduction. So I'm happy to be here at the MSI webinar and look forward to people's questions. So this research project explores how partisanship is affecting the way Americans work and shop. And if you've been following the news over the last year or so, you might have noticed that many companies and brands have been embroiled in political discussion, sometimes through their own actions and sometimes inadvertently. So for example, just listed a few of them on this slide here, and it can be basically policy positions that a company might take indirectly. So for example, Starbucks Coffee having programs to hire refugees, or it could be political donations made by executives from companies, or explicit support provided by candidates, or even when the President of the United States, for example, tweets about a brand or a company. And so a question we want to ask is that are individuals' sort of political identities spilling over into their economic decisions? So you might think that people's attachment and liking of Starbucks coffee should have nothing to do with their political viewpoints, given that these are two totally separate domains in their lives. But there's a lot of arguments to suggest that if political identities are very strong for individuals, then this might spill over into other areas of their life as well. So to help kind of motivate the various experiments we did, I want to kind of put this research into context a little bit by discussing some changes in American politics over the last 50 years. And I think the claim is that American politics looks a lot different in the 21st century than it did in the 1950s and 60s. So this graph reports data from the American National Election Study, which is arguably the most highest quality polling of political attitudes of the American public, and is conducted every 4 years going back to the 1950s. So this is just data showing how people evaluate both their own party and the opposite party over the last 30 or 40 years. And as you can see, for both Democrats and Republicans, they haven't really improved their own evaluations of their own party very much. However, their evaluations of opposing partisans have dropped considerably. And if you actually extend this time series out into 2016, these patterns have gotten more extreme. So in the 1970s, people had very lukewarm attitudes toward the opposing party. And in the most recent data, this has slipped below 30 on this feeling thermometer scale. So we do find that people have increasing negative evaluations of out-partisans, even if they're not more attached or loving of their own parties. We also see this in questions asking about non-political domains as well. So this is survey data from a question which is, would you be upset, displeased, or unhappy if your child married someone from the other party? So the top half of the graph reports data from the United States. And as you can see, in 1960, very few people would be displeased or believe it to be an issue at all if their son or daughter married someone from the opposing party. By 2008, these figures are between 20 and 30% of people being upset, And just in the last 2 years after that was taken, Republicans, about half of them are upset. And I would be very shocked if you redid this today, that these numbers would be even higher. In fact, recent data from the Pew survey suggests that is the case, with most people saying that they don't want to be friends with people of the opposing party. And this does seem to be sort of a uniquely American phenomenon in some ways. So in the bottom half of the graph, it reports data from the United Kingdom, which is another similar advanced democracy, but you don't see this sort of partisan animosity to the same levels. So what could be explaining why this is going on? And I would say that there's sort of two main reasons. So one is that political party affiliation increasingly predicts people's issue positions as well as their cultural worldview. So in the 1950s and 60s through the 70s, political party was not a great predictor of issue positions. And this is because party identification meant different things based on different regions in the country. There were liberal Republicans, there was conservative Democrats. And just an example, if you look at a few presidential elections, the 1976 election, if I said, okay, which was the candidate that was pro-life and endorsed by evangelicals like Jerry Falwell versus who was the person who was pro-choice and supported the Equal Rights Amendment for women, it might be surprising that it was actually the Democrat who was the pro-life evangelical Jimmy Carter, and it was Gerald Ford who was the more moderate pro-choice Republican. And similarly, this kind of goes beyond issues as well. Sort of in 1980, you have basically kind of a religious figure like Jimmy Carter going up against a divorced Hollywood actor, Ronald Reagan. People's issue positions are much more well sorted into parties than they have been in the past. And as a result, partisanship is increasingly a signal of people's core values or how they view the world. And then one other point to add to this is that identity has become a much more important factor of people's political reasoning. So it's not that people really have very strong issue positions and therefore join a party, but rather they have very strong identities based, for example, on their race or their ethnicity, and the parties seem to cater a lot to that. So given this context, what we really want to examine is, well, people might say on surveys that politics is very important to them and would affect various features of their life, but would they actually act on these beliefs? And this is what marketing professionals actually want to know. It's not just that would people kind of claim that party and politics is important to them, but it would actually change how they make economic decisions, like what products or services to buy. So is it the case that partisan expression is mainly cheap talk? And some research has suggested that it is, and that we should be very skeptical of survey responses. So for example, a very commonly known feature of surveys is that people tend to report factors of the economy that look good for their party. So for example, if you ask people in 2016, has the unemployment rate gone down over the last 8 years? Democrats would say that it has, but Republicans would give you the wrong answer and say that it hasn't. Similarly, if you ask Republicans and Democrats today, has the stock market gone up or down over the last year? Democrats would say it hasn't, Republicans would say that it has. However, if you actually give people some small amount of money to give you the right answer, like $1, these differences become a lot smaller, and there's less gap between the Republicans and the Democrats on how they actually evaluate the world. And also, we would worry, for example, that survey responses are subject to things like Hawthorne effects, or the fact that people behave differently if they know they're being watched or monitored than they would in more naturalistic contexts. So we have a lot of evidence that partisanship distorts what people say in surveys. And what we want to really ask about is that does it actually distort how people might behave in more natural settings where they aren't being monitored by researchers? So just to kind of motivate this a little bit more before I get into more of the experiments that we conducted in the field, I want to just kind of talk about an initial study we did, which was an incentivized survey experiment that tries to get at the cost of the idea that would people actually bear some monetary or personal cost to exhibit a partisan belief. So essentially, we conducted a survey where at the end of it, we gave people an explicit choice between two rewards. So if they accepted the higher reward, we said we were going to make a donation to the opposite party, the party that they disliked. And this was a donation we actually made. So basically, people had to weigh their distaste for the other party against their own material interests. So people actually suffer economically to express their partisan animus. And so this actually will help us get at the question, would people harm themselves? For example, would they stop buying coffee that they've enjoyed for many years? Would they stop buying a clothing product or using a service if they felt that that was contributing either directly or indirectly to a political cause that they didn't support? So at the end of the survey, which was sort of unrelated, we said, well, we want to give you an additional thank you for filling this out. We'd like to give you a bonus cash payment. And these cash payment amounts are actually pretty substantial, given that the payment for doing the survey is valued at about $1. So this is just a lot of money to these people relative to how much time they're spending taking the survey. So we said, okay, you can either take option A or option B. If you take option A, we're just going to give you $3. If you take option B, we're going to give you twice that amount, which is $6, but we're also going to make a payment to the party that you dislike, either the Republican or the Democratic National Committee, and we have data on what people's parties and affiliations are. We also had a bunch of conditions where we kind of varied the setup of this. So what I just described to you in that table earlier was just this baseline where you have a choice of getting $3 or $6 plus we make a similarly sized donation to the opposing party. Now, you might ask, well, okay, let's say we get a percentage of people who are willing to give up the money. Is that big or small? So we can do other conditions to sort of calibrate that effect. So, for example, we have something that we would call a minimal group or placebo condition, where we say, okay, well, what if we just assign people to some identification which is meaningless, that is not really a core identity? For example, whether they live east or west of the Mississippi River. So we said, okay, well, we'll either give you $3 or you could have $6 plus a donation to an organization that builds projects east or west of the Mississippi River. And then we might also want to say, okay, well, how big would this effect be to another large social cleavage in the country like religion? So this was done among Christian and atheist respondents. We said, well, would you rather have $3 or $6 plus a donation to a Christian or atheist organization? We also might want to know how elastic are these effects. So, we said, okay, would you rather have $3 or double that amount of money? So what happens if we increase it to $9? Would that have a larger effect on the uptake rate or a smaller effect? So I'm going to pause right here to sort of have people in their own minds guess how big they think these effects would be to kind of see, before I kind of show you what the results are. So here's the results. So in the full sample, we find that 75% of people are willing to forego more money to avoid helping the other party. And this is, in my view, pretty big amount of money, given that, that people have the opportunity to get more money, but it seems more important to them to express their partisan interest. So this just suggests that people are willing to put their money where their mouth is and undergo some sort of material harm to express their partisan beliefs. So you might say, well, how do you know that this is the fact that they don't like donating to the opposite party? Maybe they just don't like donating to politics in general. Well, that's a good point. So we did a follow-up study where we gave people a choice between a smaller payment and then a higher payment plus a donation to their own party. So this is sort of a no-brainer, it would seem. You would take the higher payment and donate to your own party, unless you just don't like political donation generally. And in this case, we found that very few people, only 15%, accepted the smaller payment. So that's substantially different than the 75%. So if you feel like you want to sort of subtract all the numbers I give you by about 10 to 20 percentage points, that's okay to do. They still suggest that the majority of people are willing to undertake material costs. So how big is this 75 percentage points? Well, it's about the same size as other major social cleavages we would think of, like religion, and it's much larger than what you would consider to be some sort of placebo or minimal group attachment like geography. So who's actually exhibiting this effect? So you might think, well, this is totally driven by people who just care a lot about politics, are activists, but kind of the normal person would probably take more money. But that's actually not the case. So it is true that people that have stronger attachments to their parties are much less likely to take the higher payment. But even among people who have weak attachments to their parties or are independents who just claim that they lean towards the party, nearly 70% of people undergo some material harm to express their partisan beliefs. And as we might expect, these differences are smaller to non-existent for the other conditions. Okay, so how elastic are these effects? Because maybe you would argue, well, I should just be able to increase the amount of money that people have to leave on the table, and maybe these effects would go away. But that's not what we find at all. So we could change the reward from a doubling of the payment to a tripling of the payment, and this only decreases the selection rate of option A by a few percentage points. And in fact, these figures imply an elasticity of only 0.07, which means that there's an extremely inelastic demand here with respect to the price. So this first study basically is to sort of help motivate and kind of say, okay, well, there's probably a reason we should do some more stringent investigation, given that it seems just when you make a reward explicit for people, they seem to be willing to give up some money to express their partisanship. So we said, okay, well, let's try to export this into other contexts, like employment and consumer markets that people engage in. So the first study we did took place in a labor market. So there, as you might know, there's plenty of opportunities for people to do contract work over the internet. There's companies like Odesk, Mechanical Turk, etc. So we posted a job ad that said, well, we want people to help copy edit a website for grammatical and typographical mistakes, and that we'll give you $3 if you do this. And given how long people took to do this task, it implied an hourly wage of about $12 per hour. So when they clicked on the link to complete our task, we had them do an intake questionnaire. They were told that we just want to get demographic impacts data on our workers to kind of learn about diversity of our workforce. And within this, we sort of unobtrusively asked about their partisanship. And they were shown sort of a block of text to edit. And this block of text also inserted our randomly assigned treatment. So in the control condition, the text of the website stated that the founders used to work for nonprofit organizations. And in the treatment groups, it said they used to work for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party on fundraising efforts. So essentially, this is a very subtle way to signal what the partisan leanings of the firm are. And we know that people are going to be reading it and paying attention because they're going through it and editing the website. We also purposely inserted 11 grammatical errors into the document to assess sort of the quality of their work output. Okay, so what are the outcome variables we want to measure here? So at the end of the task, we asked subjects to say what is their reservation wage. So how much would they have to, would we have to pay them so that they would do a similar job for us in the future? So this gets at an idea called a compensating differential, or do people require higher amounts of money to work for people they don't like, or do they give discounts for people that they want to like, that they want to work for? And so we can actually see, would people actually give up some money in order to work for somebody they liked, or they demand more money and perhaps not get the job to work for a group that they have some partisan disagreement with. We also recorded the number of errors caught out of a possible total of 11 errors. And finally, as you might imagine, people have a bunch of copy editing corrections outside of these 11 errors potentially. So we also recorded the total corrections the subject caught as a measure of their overall effort on the task. So to get a sense of what this looked like, this is basically what the text they had to edit was, and in there is sort of the treatment that was embedded. So I'll put it in a bigger screen for you to see exactly what the text was. So it said, our founders, Chris and Matt, met as committed volunteers working for, and either they saw the Republican campaigns, Democratic campaigns, or nonprofit organizations. And then they said, after their successful efforts working for these three groups. So as I mentioned before, based on the intake questionnaire, we have what their party identification is, and so we can basically recode this treatment variable to say, are they basically think they're working for a co-partisan, a counter-partisan, or a control sort of independent. So these were the results. So I first want to direct you to the first and third columns. So in the control group, people said that they would like $3.41 to do this task again. And there's actually no difference between that and the counterpartisan condition. So people actually did not demand more money to work for a partisan boss that they disagreed with. And you actually see similar null effects for the other two variables as well, which is the number of the errors they caught out of 11, and then the total errors that they caught. However, we do find significant differences between the first and the second column, or between the control group and when people think they're working for a fellow partisan that's on their side. So if you look at the wage differentials, we see that people are willing to work for a lot less money if they're working for a side that they agree with. And you might say, okay, well, how big is 22 cents? Is that big or small? As a percentage of the total hourly wage, it's really big. And it's actually on par with a lot of other wage differences that we normally feel to be important. So for example, we also asked about people's level of education and experience. And as probably not surprisingly, people with more education demand more money, and people with more experience demand more money. And this 22-cent effect is on par with some of those education and experience effects. So it seems to be very, very large. If you look at the next two rows, you see that people actually do a worse job for people that they're working for, that they agree with. So you can see that the number of errors caught goes down, and the number of total errors goes down. So there seems to be some sort of shirking effect where they feel that maybe they don't have to do as good of a job for someone that they already agree with. Now this might seem kind of counterintuitive, but other research that's been done recently has supported this view based on this idea of moral licensing, that if people kind of feel that they're doing the right thing, it might lead them to shirk in other domains. So for example, there was a major field experiment recently done that found that when companies engage in corporate social responsibility, it actually makes their workers do a worse job, even if the workers like the company more. So we find actually very strong evidence here that there's sort of a discount given for co-partisans, but really no evidence of out-group animus. So that's basically how people were interacting in a labor and employment market. And so the next study is perhaps more of interest to this audience here, which is in product markets. So we want to examine how partisanship shapes the economic behavior of buyers and sellers. So to do this experiment, we obtained a list of over 1,700 consumers. So these are primarily Democrats. So this is one sort of limitation of this specific study, that we didn't really have Republicans, but I'll show you another study where we have a more diverse group of consumers. And these are people who signed a petition on climate change and reported information of their individual level partisanship. So we basically just did sort of an email marketing plan to them, where we offered them an Amazon gift card, and it was priced at a deep discount. So it was a $50 card for $25. So we wanted to have sort of a very general product that they could use to buy almost anything, and make an attractive offer. And so the subjects were told that these cards were being sold at a discount because they were left over from collaborations with volunteers. So the control condition, they were told the collaboration was with a nonprofit organization, and in the treatment groups, either Democratic campaigns or Republican campaigns. And so the outcome variables are, did the consumer initially respond to our offer, and also did they ultimately proceed with purchasing the card? So these were all real cards that we did sell at $25 losses. So the results I'll show you for responding to the email. The overall transaction results are very similar as well. So as you can see, I want to again focus you on the first and the third columns, and we get the same exact result as we did for the labor market experiment, so that there's no real difference in the response rates between the control group and the counterpartisan. So it's not that people are less willing to buy from people that they dislike. However, we see significant effects if you compare the first and the second columns. So the baseline rates are about 2.1 percentage points of responding to the offer. So this is generally in line, if you look at the literature, with kind of what response rates are from email solicitations. They're actually on the higher end, if anything. And if you basically signal that the seller is a co-partisan, this uptake rate nearly doubles. And you can see that these effects are pretty much concentrated amongst people who have the strongest attachments to their parties. So it's a 2.5x increase for strong partisans, and basically a null effect for weak partisans. So we wanted to replicate this study in a more naturalistic context, and where we have more of a diversity of buyers. So we conducted an experiment on Craigslist, where we basically did the same thing. We sold this Amazon gift card priced at a deep discount. And these kind of offers are actually very common on Craigslist, these deeply discounted gift cards. And the areas Craigslist operates in are very diverse. So the downside to this sort of setup is that we actually don't know what the partisanship of a buyer is on Craigslist, unlike with our other design. So we had a similar situation where we told people that their cards were left over, thank you gifts from volunteers at a fundraiser, and we wanted to sell these cards at a discount to get rid of them. And again, sort of what the nonprofit organization is, whether it's a political organization or not, is manipulated. And we also further tried to signal the partisanship of the seller based on what the email address was that was responded to them. So these are the results, and I know this is probably a bit hard to see. So these results are a little bit mixed, but one thing we did find an effect on is this bottom graph. So I'll kind of run through what this graph is in a little bit. But on the x-axis is basically what was Mitt Romney's strength in the 2012 election, because this was run between the 2012 and 2016 elections. So to get a sense of what the partisan leaning of a Craigslist market was, we said, okay, well, how well did Mitt Romney do there relative to Barack Obama? And we can then say, okay, well, how many offers did we get to a Republican ad versus a neutral ad? And at least for this comparison, we do find that in the areas where Obama did very well, you can think of Berkeley, California, San Francisco, etc., The Republican ad performs more poorly. There's about 2 less offers we get. And then in the more conservative areas, like Oklahoma City, the ad gets 2 more responses compared to the control group. So I'll discuss sort of some of the overall conclusions and then kind of put some of these effects into more context. So for many Americans, politics has become an extended feature of their social identities, influencing and shaping their behavior on topics that seem really unrelated to politics, including their economic interactions. And this is actually sort of a big topic that a lot of people are looking at, not only related to sort of economic decisions, but social decisions like who people want to have friends with, who they want to engage in romantic relationships with, other decisions like how they approach their jobs, and also kind of where to live, etc. So one thing that we find is that in our designs we can differentiate between in-group favoritism and out-group animus as rationales for our effects, and we find that actually sometimes in-group favoritism does dominate out-group animus. So one interesting thing we found is that in the explicit survey context, which was the first study I showed you, out-group animus seemed to be pretty much the driving effect, that people wanted to avoid giving money to the opposite party. But in our more naturalistic settings, it seems that in-group favoritism was the dominant effect. So one thing that could be going on is that when politics is made very explicit in a survey context, it sort of activates people's partisan identities. But when people are kind of behaving more naturalistically as workers or buyers, they might be less likely to exhibit those identities. So one thing that I also think is pretty interesting is that the effects seem to be very large when they do emerge. So in the labor market experiment, the effects on the reservation wage and on task performance were comparable to those similar effects for education and experience. One thing I failed to mention is that, as you might also expect, more educated and more experienced workers do better jobs on the task. So partisanship has sort of a similar effect as education and experience. In the marketing experiment we did, co-partisanship doubles the purchasing rate, and that in the first study I showed you, 75% of people give up money, and that even among people who don't have a very strong attachment to their parties, the percentage is well over 50%. So I just want to leave with just one kind of general thought, which is, well, okay, so obviously a lot more work has to be done on this subject, but what are kind of unique aspects of what we did which may not translate into a company which has, let's say, a strong brand reputation and a strong relationship with customers? So I think there's 2 factors that I think are unique about the studies we did. So the first is that partisanship is very unobtrusive in the labor market and consumer market experiments. That is basically something incidental in the biography of either the seller or the employer. So this is very different than if a company explicitly attached themselves to a political party or a political belief. So it seems that when politics is very incidental, and it's not really the company's fault or not something they're actively trying to do, there doesn't appear to be very much out-group punishment, but does appear to be some in-group favoritism. And I think the other second thing that's unique about this group of studies is that there was no prior relationship between the seller and the buyer or between the employer and the employee. So this is very different from other contexts in the real world where a customer has a long-standing relationship with the brand, for example. So why might that matter? Well, it depends kind of what people learn and how they update their beliefs. So generally, if people get an email solicitation from somebody they don't know, they don't trust it. So as a result, if you tell them, oh, let's say you're a Democratic buyer, and you tell them, oh, this is a Republican that's selling to you, well, you don't really learn anything, right? You say, well, I didn't really trust this seller before, and now I definitely don't trust this seller. On the other hand, if you tell them that it's someone who shares your party identification, they might learn something about the trustworthiness, and say, okay, well, now maybe I trust this person a little bit more because they share my values, and so it makes you more likely to engage with them. So you kind of update positively. So it's possible that when, as just a theory I have that hasn't been tested, is that when there isn't a long-standing relationship between a brand and a customer, it's possible that the biggest effects you see are in-group favoritism. However, when there is a long-standing relationship, you might see more out-group animosity because the only way someone can update their evaluation of a brand is downwards. So that's the material that I have for you guys today. I will note that this is sort of a topic I and other people are kind of interested in. So if this is something that your firm is also interested in, you can feel free to send me an email, neilm@stanford.edu, and perhaps there's areas for collaboration. But I'll leave the rest of the time for Q&A, and then also happy to go into more specific details of the experiments if people have them.
Thanks very much, Neil. It was very interesting, and we do have some questions coming in. One of them is that some marketers argue that millennials in particular are especially attuned to causes and values-based consumption. Do you see any age interaction, or do you have any other effects that maybe you're either observed or hypothesized about age, in particular the millennial generation?
That's a great topic. We did not look at the results by age cohorts, but that's such a great question that I'm probably will want to look back at the data after this webinar. So one problem with some of our studies is that they basically only had sufficient sample size to look at the overall effects, and they didn't really have enough sample to slice the data in all these specific ways. But one thing that we did notice was that Democrats seem to be more likely to exhibit these effects than Republicans. And one thing, and it's interesting to see if millennials are actually driving that, because younger generations are much more heavily likely to be Democratic, especially given these cohorts which have gone through the last few presidents. And so if I had to guess, I would suspect that younger people might be exhibiting this effect more, particularly given that Democrats do so.
Here's one that, in a sense, sort of builds on that. What do you think about the possible trending here? With these results, how would they have looked 4 years ago? How would you think they might look in the future? I guess you've sort of answered that in a way. You think some trending exists, but let me ask you to give your point of view on that.
Sure. And so basically, my answer is going to be conjecture, mainly because, we did these studies prior, actually, to the 2016 election. So we don't have, like, a huge time series of these kind of studies going back in time. But the survey data we do have, it does suggest that at least in stated preferences, these effects are getting more acute and worse over time. And I would say that I kind of agree with Justin's question, which is that I think these effects are larger after the 2016 campaign than they were before. And to kind of go back to something I said in the first part of the talk, is I think the reason for this is that partisanship is more likely to be a social identity to people than it was before. And so we have some data that does suggest that. So for example, it generally is the case that people do not have issue preferences and then choose their party based on that, but rather they have a partisan identity and then select their issue preferences after that. So an example of that is that during the Obama administration, Republicans had a very negative view towards Vladimir Putin, and that view has become much more positive over the last year or so. Similarly, Republicans tended to be generally very pro-free trade. Now the Democrats are more likely to be pro-free trade than Republicans. So all that just goes to show that identity is a very key part of what partisanship is nowadays. The strongest predictor of voting for Donald Trump in the primaries was not any issue position related to free trade, but it was how important someone's white identity was to them. So this would suggest that if identity is a bigger part of people's political beliefs, it's more likely to spill over.
Yeah. Yeah, there was, and you can see it there, there was a question on the sample sources. You mentioned Amazon Turk was the source for some, maybe all parts of the study. I'm not sure. Can you talk a little more about the different sources, or if it was all Amazon Turk, and what potential implications that might have for the conclusions that you've drawn?
Sure. So the first study the survey experiment is from GfK Knowledge Panel. So this is a really high quality internet-based sample. I would say arguably the highest quality internet-based sample you can get that recruits people via probability sampling methods like address-based sampling, and then gives them free internet access and computer equipment. So the first sample is basically a random sample of the U.S. population. And then you get into sort of weirder samples, right? So for example, the labor market is people who are doing work on Mechanical Turk. Maybe those are weird people. The consumer market is people who sign online petitions, people who tend to buy goods and services on Craigslist. So this is, I think, one reason why we should be replicating these kind of studies going forward, to see would these effects kind of show up among different and more diverse groups of people.
Got it. So a question about replication. These results, you have some, well, the experiments, I guess, are U.S.-based. You had some other results that had some U.K. results. Here's the question about if you were to do this in Mexico, where there are four main partisan options, how would that work? What would be your advice on how to do it if you wanted to replicate in Mexico, a country where it's not just two parties, but potentially four?
Yeah, so a lot of the way you replicate this has to be very sensitive to the political, institutional, cultural context. The nice thing about Mexico is that it's sort of a presidential system that's very similar to the United States in a lot of ways. So you could, in Mexico, you could replicate this with the 3 or 4 major parties, and then, because there's still the idea of in-party, out-party. You could also get very interesting things in Mexico because you have a few parties more on the left, one party on the right, and you could say, well, maybe the people on the extreme left are more negative towards the extreme right than the PRI, for example. So that's how I would do it in Mexico. But I think in other countries it gets more complicated. So, for example, in some European democracies, you have many, many parties, very different coalitions, parties entering in and out of the coalition. I would say issues matter much more in these kind of democratic settings. I think a lot of what we've done is very tailored to the U.S. case. So if you were to export this around the world, you'd have to know much more about the political institutions there.
To that point about U.S.-based, a few minutes ago we were talking about some of these results, I think, becoming more extreme over time. Is that, do you think, a U.S. phenomenon, or do you think that is more, at least maybe not global, but happening in other places as well?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. My sense is that the U.S. is, I would say there's one reason to suggest it is a U.S. phenomenon and one reason to suggest it's not. So the U.S. is actually very unique in that in the 1960s, you have essentially a 3-party system, but nobody really kind of knows it's a 3-party system. So you have, Southern Democrats, Northern Democrats, and Republicans. So as a result, when you tell people you're a Republican or a Democrat, it doesn't have the same bite that it does today, and we've had a very slow 50-year process where conservatives have been sorted into the Republican Party, liberals have been sorted into the Democratic Party. That's a very unique aspect of American political history that's not the case in other countries. On the other hand, in other countries, you see this idea of populism and globalization emerging just like you do in the United States, both in terms of labor mobility and immigration, as well as capital mobility and trade. So, for example, you could argue that as the UK, for example, becomes more of this sort of Brexit and anti-Brexit, political cleavages, you may have more identity-related concerns. And I just think it's going to be more complicated because these effects are all driven by party labels cleanly mapping on to identities. And in the UK, that's very complicated given that now both parties that are the major parties are pro-Brexit parties. So I would say there's reasons to believe it could or could not be a U.S. phenomenon.
One related question I have is what do you speculate or think or have data on regarding the role of media, mass media, in this process? I mean, I don't know, it's probably a little unfair question because that's not what you're studying right now, but I'm curious what you think about that to the extent that media influences these kinds of attitudes and behaviors.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's one kind of wrinkle to this, which is in all of our experiments, kind of the person presenting the information is sort of the company itself. Whereas, in the real world, media is oftentimes the one reporting if a company is embroiled in politics somehow. And one kind of unique part about our media environment is that people self-select into it. So I'm sure the way that Starbucks was getting involved into the political debate was reported on differently in Fox News versus MSNBC. And also some of these, I think the big part about media distinction is not about necessarily how they cover it, but what they exactly choose to cover. And I think the debate is very open on that. So some people support this sort of echo chamber view, and if you kind of believe that view of things, then this is much more dangerous for companies because then you have basically a media source that's spinning and speaking to a specific group of people. On the other hand, some people have found that people's media diets are very balanced, and they actually get information from different sources. And in that case, maybe the way a company is politicized can be spun in both positive and negative ways, and people are influenced by both of those. But that would be another great way to extend this, is to add the media in there.
Right. There are a number of questions there that are about the experiments themselves. Let me go back to a few of those. Could the lower number of errors found also be a type of in-group bias, as in they assume that their own group is less likely to have many errors to find, or alternatively, they do not want to make that group feel bad by pointing out errors?
Yep, exactly. I think that's 100% possibility. That's something we actually mentioned in the paper itself as a possibility. I just sort of neglected to mention it. And sort of this study was not well designed to get at some of those mechanisms. So in the future, we want to maybe ask questions like, how intelligent do you think this employer is, or something like that. But that could definitely be a cause of the results as well. So that was a good question.
Yep. Another one, I'm puzzled by the reluctance of nonpartisans to take the share deal, even if it means more dollars to them. Is it possible that this skepticism is somehow about the experimental setup?
So just want to clarify what we mean by nonpartisans. People who are pure independents are actually excluded from this. So they're not actually showing up on this graph I'm showing you, on this figure I'm showing you. So the way we normally ask partisanship is you first ask people if they're a Democrat or Republican or an independent. And if you ask them if they're an independent, you say, do you lean towards the Democratic Party, Republican Party, or neither? So this just includes the people who lean towards the parties. And then the percentage of people who are actually pure independents is pretty much zero. It's very, very small in the sample. And also one thing to note is people who lean towards the party behave a lot like people who are kind of pure partisans in terms of their voting for candidates. And you can see here how they would react to an offer like this. So I don't think there's any, so we didn't look at pure independents themselves, just because there wasn't very many of them. But the person asking the question is right. We probably, if you looked at that group specifically, we would not expect to see these very high effects.
Right. You say that the results are more driven by in-group favoritism than out-group animus. Is there a reason to believe that's different for the political domain than other domains? Is there, other literature on this from other domains, perhaps, that can be brought to bear?
Yeah, there definitely is. So this idea of sort of group favoritism and group bias is sort of an old idea in psychology, and they generally find in-group favoritism and not out-group animus. However, when people who study politics have imported some of these ideas, they generally find out-group animus and not in-group favoritism. So you even see that with just the basic slide on the feeling thermometers that I showed you at the beginning. Okay, so you might ask, well, does this mean that politics is sort of a unique group affiliation as opposed to some of the other ones that psychologists have studied, including things that you would argue have sort of some bite to them, like race and ethnicity? So on the one hand, you could say, okay, maybe politics is unique, that it's something that there's not norms to be sort of discriminatory to the outgroup against. It's something that's inherent about competition. So it's something you might also find among, sports fans, where I assure you there's a lot of outgroup animus. So that's one view of it. The other point I would say is that it's possible that most of our evidence about outgroup animus when it comes to politics is coming from surveys. And what the survey is really doing is it's really making it explicit that this is something that's activating your political tendencies. Whereas if you look at most of our studies, politics is very incidental to what's going on. So it could be that what's going on is that when you make politics very salient, explicit, and hot, that is what gets people thinking about it in terms of outgroup animus. Whereas when it's not really that salient, it's more of an issue of in-group love. But I still think these are open questions, and I think it is sort of an interesting puzzle given how much of the previous literature has been about in-group love.
Well, in a number of areas, you pointed out to what other things could be done in terms of other kinds of research. Can you say more about where you plan to go with this, or where you are already going in terms of future research? Because you've teed up a number of issues in addition to presenting the results of things that would be good to look at. What's your outlook for this?
Yeah, so I'll just give some ideas of things I'm interested in, or if somebody kind of wants to work on. But what I think would be great is if you kind of look for more natural experiments. So where in the real world, a company that kind of wasn't politicized somehow gets politicized through perhaps no fault of their own, or through maybe some bad management. And you can maybe look before and after to see how people's evaluations of the brand or how their purchasing behavior changes. So they're not like perfect experiments. So a good example is the NFL. There is data on like which brands are most politicized. So that's basically where the gap between Republicans and Democrats' assessment of the brand is really big. So some of them are these kind of more obvious political brands like Chick-fil-A that you see, but most of them are media companies, as you might expect. But the one unique brand which is in that top list is the NFL. And obviously they've become politicized. Some people argue just by accident. Some people argue through bad management. But it would be very interesting to see basically how like ticket sales, how viewing behavior, how purchases of analogous products like Papa John's pizza, etc., have changed over time. I think those are fascinating questions. Especially, the CEO of Papa John's basically blamed falling sales for politicization, on politicization. So was he right? Was he not right? Those are interesting questions, I think.
Well, I'm really glad you raised that question that way, and we're glad to help facilitate in any way companies getting involved in this and collaborating with you. So you gave out your email address. I don't know if we have it on a slide you could put up again at the end. But we encourage everybody in the audience to reach out to Neil or send a note to us at MSI as well. I'm glad to help with that. For those that are new to MSI, that's a big part of our mission, to encourage collaboration between academics and practitioners. Another example somebody just suggested for us is Pepsi is a good case to consider with the Kendall Jenner controversy. So yeah, there are probably a lot of examples out there. If you're now giving your presentation and the questions and answers, people are thinking about it. So hopefully this will generate some further feedback. We just have a couple minutes left. Neil, anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up? Just further comments or anything else? If not, go ahead.
Oh, no. I just want to kind of reiterate that I think that, a lot of the stuff I've shown you today is mainly like kind of proof of concept or thinking how you might set up some of these investigations or studies. So it's not meant to be the final word, but more to kind of say, okay, well, here's some initial evidence we have that we've never had before. And as you said, hopefully it stimulates people's juices going and thinking, how else would we kind of do this? And if this is something that people even kind of do on their own or go back and sort of analyze some internal firm data, I'd also be really interested to hear what people are finding. So if you want to share with me what you guys are finding, that would be great as well.
Great. Well, thanks very much. It's a great presentation. I think the Q&A was very good, and hopefully will stimulate some further follow-ups. And if anyone has additional things, they could send them a note to Neil m@stanford.edu. And so thanks again. We'll wrap that up. And just as a reminder, our next webinar will be the second webinar in our Best of MSI series, Marketing at the Privacy Crossroads, and that'll be with Walmart's Chief Privacy Officer, John Avila, on January 18th. So thanks again to Neil, and many thanks to the members of the MSI audience for participating in our member-to-member webinar series.